When a man thought he had nothing left to lose, the world sent him a lesson. He never expected that sometimes the most extraordinary bonds are forged in the heat of survival. What began as a simple rescue turned into a journey that neither of them were ready for. If you think fate has a strange way of connecting us, like subscribe and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. In the gray haze before sunrise, the small town of Brookhaven, Mississippi still slept under a damp quilt of fog and silence. Crickets had gone quiet, the air heavy with that slow stillness that comes before rain. Out in a pasture behind a rusted trailer, Langston Price, a middle-aged black mechanic with rough hands and a tired face, knelt beside his German shepherd Iona. Her flanks shuddered with each contraction, her breathing shallow and uneven. Langston pressed his palm against her ribcage and felt her heart galloping beneath thin fur. "Come on, girl, you've got this," he whispered, voice trembling like a man speaking to God for the first time. The ground was wet beneath his knees, the scent of mud and oil clinging to his jacket from the garage where he'd worked late. A flashlight balanced on an overturned bucket cast a sickly yellow cone over the scene, one man, one dog, and a silent war against time. Iona whined again, her eyes glassy, her body twisting weakly. Langston's throat tightened. He'd seen this before on farms growing up, dogs who labored too long, who fought nature and lost. But not her, not Iona. She wasn't just a dog. She was the reason he still breathed. 2 years ago, a storm had swept through Brookhaven like a curse, tearing through homes, flooding the river, and swallowing his truck whole when he tried to drive across the old bridge. He remembered the crash, the roar of water, and the moment everything went dark. When he woke cough in mud, it was Iona dragging his jacket sleeve between her teeth, clawing his body up the bank inch by inch. The scar down her leg never healed right, a pale streak against black fur, a living memory of the night she saved him. Now, watching her body convulse in pain, Langston felt the universe folding in on itself. The first twist of fate came cruelly. Her strength was fading. The first pup hadn't come, and the tremors that once shook her body began to slow. He pressed his forehead against hers, whispering, "You pulled me out of that river, girl. Don't you leave me here." Her breathing hitched, then weakened again. Panic hit him like cold steel. He looked toward the dirt road, desperate for headlights, a miracle, anything. His phone showed no signal. He ran to the fence, shouting for help that wouldn't come. Only fog answered back. And then there it was, a dim glow cutting through the mist, an engine hum crawling closer. Langston stumbled into the road, waving both arms like a man drowning on dry land. The old Jeep slowed, its lights flaring against the fog. When the driver stepped out, Langston saw an older man in a worn coat, a face lined like cracked leather eyes that carried a kind of quiet sorrow. "Please," Langston gasped, pointing to the field. "She's dying, my dog, please." The man hesitated, the kind of hesitation that comes from ghosts only he could see. Dr. Emery Cade, a former veterinarian, had once been known for saving anything with a heartbeat, until a flood took both his daughter and the animals he'd tried to rescue. He hadn't practiced since. Now the second twist revealed itself. He turned to leave. "I'm sorry," he muttered, voice brittle. But then Iona cried out again, a sound so raw, it tore through the fog like lightning. Emery froze. His hand tightened around the truck door. The cry wasn't just pain, it was defiance, a plea, a heartbeat refusing to quit. He turned back toward the pasture, shoulders heavy with the weight of memory, and followed Langston without another word. In the dim half-light, they reached the trembling dog. Emery's instinct took over, kneeling, checking pulse-scanning eyes. "She's too far along," he said quietly. "If we don't act now, she'll die." Langston nodded without hesitation. "Then do something. I'll help." His voice cracked, not from fear, but from the terrible calm of a man with nothing left to lose. Emery exhaled, opened an old leather satchel from his truck, and laid out his tools on a tattered towel. He hadn't touched them in years, but his hands remembered. "Hold her steady," he said. Langston obeyed, his rough palms trembling as they pressed against her chest. Iona's eyes rolled, her breath shallow. Lightning flickered far off in the distance. The two men worked in silence, the kind that carries both prayer and confession. "She's losing blood," Emery muttered. "I can't promise she'll make it." Langston whispered, "Just try." The rain began to fall, gentle at first, then steadier, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Iona let out another cry, weaker now, and for a moment, Langston thought that was it, that the world had gone still again. But she stirred. Her paw twitched. Emery looked up sharply. "She's fighting." He adjusted his grip, eyes narrowing. "Good girl, stay with us." Langston couldn't speak. His entire body trembled with the same rhythm as her faint breathing. He remembered that night by the river, the way her teeth had dug into his sleeve, refusing to let go, even as the current dragged them both. He remembered waking on the bank, choking with her head resting on his chest. Now all he could do was return that same faith. As dawn broke across the field, the fog lifted slightly, revealing the first hint of pink along the horizon. The rain hadn't stopped. It came down in soft sheets that blurred the world into gray, turning the pasture into a mirror of shallow puddles and trembling grass. The makeshift operation under the tarp had stabilized Iona, but she was fading fast. Langston Price crouched beside her, his calloused hand never leaving her paw, whispering her name between shallow breaths, as though he could will life into her veins. Beside him, Dr. Emery Cade adjusted the tarp's edge and glanced at the sky. He hadn't intended to be there. For years he had driven through nights like this with the windows down and the radio off, trying to drown out the sound of the flood that had taken his daughter and half the shelter animals he'd once sworn to protect. His veterinary license had expired. His medical bag was a relic from another life, still packed out of habit, not purpose. Yet somehow that cry, the one the dog made when he tried to drive away, had pierced through everything he thought was buried. He looked down at her again now, at the white streak along her leg, and something familiar flickered in the back of his mind. "She's been here before," he muttered. Langston looked up, rain dripping from his hair. What Emery's hands trembled slightly as he cleaned a blade. This dog. That scar she was treated after the flood near Tallahatchie 3 years ago. "I gave that first stitch." He glanced at Langston. "How long have you had her?" Langston blinked, remembering the night he'd pulled her from a storm drain weeks before she saved him. 2 years. Emery nodded slowly, as if the timeline filled in a missing page of his life. She came in half dead. Most didn't make it that day. He swallowed hard. She was the only one who bit through the leash and ran. The weight of the coincidence pressed between them, thick and silent. Iona's chest rose unevenly. Langston's voice cracked. "Maybe she ran so she could find me." Emery looked away, pretending to adjust his tools, but the truth sat heavy in his chest. That dog had survived something he couldn't save his own child from, and now fate had dragged her and him back to the same crossroad. He reached for a small syringe and tested the plunger. "I can give her something for strength. It's risky, but it might buy us time." Langston nodded immediately. "Do it." Emery hesitated. His mind screamed not to. His last field injection had gone wrong years ago when floodwater filled his clinic and his hands shook too much to steady the needle. He'd sworn off saving things that couldn't be saved. Yet here he was, again kneeling in the mud, beside a stranger staring down a living reminder of everything he'd lost. He steadied the needle, found the vein, and pressed the plunger. The rain slowed, almost as if holding its breath. Iona twitched once, twice, then let out a soft whimper. Her eyes fluttered open, the faintest glint of gold peeking through the haze. "There you go," Langston whispered, his thumb brushing her fur. Emery exhaled, half in relief, half in disbelief. "It's working." He sat back on his heels, the ache in his chest flaring again. "You're lucky," he said quietly. Most people would have left her. Langston's reply came low and even. She never left me. I couldn't live with myself if I did. His words struck Emery harder than he expected. The vet wiped his face, though he wasn't sure if it was rain or tears. You sound like someone who's already lost too much. You sound like someone who stopped fighting. Langston shot back, not unkindly. Emery froze. The truth in that sentence cut deeper than accusation. It was recognition. The two men stared at each other, neither willing to admit how close to collapse they both were. Then a sharp sound broke the tension. Iona jerked suddenly, another contraction seizing her body. Emery was on his knees instantly. "She's not done," he said, voice taut. "Help me turn her." Langston slid his arms under her chest, careful not to hurt her. The dog shuddered violently, letting out a strained bark that echoed across the soaked pasture. Lightning flashed again, outlining their silhouettes. Man-dog and vet locked in a battle older than pride. "Come on, girl," Langston whispered. "You can do this." The first pup, already breathing from the last stage's fight, squirmed near the edge of the tarp. Emery covered it gently with a towel and returned his focus to Iona. Her body was giving up faster than he could keep up. "We need to move her," he said finally. "If she stays out here, she'll die from exposure before she finishes." Langston nodded, though his voice trembled. "Clinic's far, 12 miles. Then we drive." Emery blinked, rain dripping from his brow. "You sure your truck runs?" "It runs when it needs to." Together they lifted Iona carefully into the back of Emery's Jeep, her breathing shallow but steadying with the stimulant. Langston climbed in beside her, one arm wrapped protectively around her body as if he could shield her from the world. Emery started the engine, the hum of the old motor filling the silence. As they pulled onto the road, the rain thinned to a mist, and dawn broke fully across the sky, pale and reluctant. For a long stretch, neither man spoke. The sound of the tires through puddles and the faint, irregular breathing of the dog were all that existed. Then softly, Emery said, "That scar on her leg, she bit through her leash because she didn't want to die tied down." Langston looked out the window, voice low. "Guess we've both done that." Emery gave the faintest nod, his eyes on the road. The fog began to lift, revealing miles of flooded farmland. Somewhere between the rhythm of the road and the rasp of the engine, something shifted inside him. He wasn't running anymore. He was heading towards something again, even if it was just one last chance to make things right. As the Jeep climbed a small hill, a new sound filled the air, a faint, uneven panting from the back seat. Iona stirred, licking Langston's sleeve, her eyes barely open. He whispered, "We're almost there, girl. You just hang on." Emery glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing her eyes meet his. For a second, they didn't look like an animal's eyes at all. They looked human, haunted, forgiving, alive. And in that fragile exchange, the past that chained him loosened its grip. He turned his focus to the winding road ahead, pressing the accelerator as thunder rumbled behind them. The road to the clinic wound through low country hills slick with rain, the old Jeep rattling with each turn. Langston Price held Iona close in the back seat, her body trembling in uneven waves. Dr. Emery Cade gripped the wheel tight, his knuckles pale against the cracked leather eyes fixed on the thin yellow line that shimmered ahead. The wipers squealed across the glass, failing to keep up with the downpour. "We'll make it," he said, half to himself. Langston didn't answer. His focus was on the faint rise and fall of Iona's chest. Every shallow breath sounded like it might be her last. He pressed his hand against her side, whispering, "Stay with me, girl. Don't quit on me now." Her paw flexed weakly in his grip, a flicker of response, and that was enough to keep him believing. Emery stole glances in the mirror, watching the man cradle the dog like a wounded child. He hadn't seen that kind of loyalty in years, not since the flood, not since his own daughter's golden retriever had drowned beside her. His heart constricted at the memory. The resemblance was unbearable, the same breed, the same trusting eyes. He forced the thought away, and pressed harder on the accelerator. "We'll need to sedate her when we get there," he muttered almost mechanically. "You'll have to hold her still while I work." Langston nodded without looking up. "I'll do whatever you need." The vet didn't answer. He didn't trust his own voice. When they reached the clinic, the parking lot was half flooded. The sign above the door still read Cade Animal Care, though the paint had faded and a letter hung loose on its hinge. Emery hadn't been inside in almost 3 years. The thought of returning there made his pulse quicken, but he shoved the door open anyway. "Bring her," he said quietly. Together they carried Iona inside, laying her on an old steel table under the flickering light. The air smelled of dust and disinfectant ghosts of a life once lived here. Langston ran a hand over her head, his voice shaking. "She's cold. I'll get a blanket," Emery said, already rummaging through a cabinet. The vet's hands trembled as he found his old surgical cloths still neatly folded untouched. He had walked away from this room because he couldn't stand its silence, the silence that came after the flood, when no heartbeats answered his own. Now the same silence filled the space, broken only by Iona's faint panting. He draped the blanket over her and checked her pulse, weak but steady. Her eyes darted to him, pupils wide with fear. When he reached to examine her abdomen, she growled a low, guttural sound of warning. Langston tensed. "She's scared," he said softly. "She doesn't know you. She doesn't need to." Emery replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "I just need her to stay still." He tried again, placing a hand on her side. She snapped, teeth grazing his wrist. Emery pulled back instinctively, heart racing. Langston stepped in between them, his voice low and firm. "Easy, girl. It's okay." He lowered himself until his face was level with hers, their eyes meeting. "He's here to help. You hear me? He's not gonna hurt you." For a moment, nothing changed. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste. Then slowly Iona's ears relaxed. Her breathing steadied. She pressed her nose weakly against his sleeve, as if acknowledging his words. Emery exhaled in disbelief. "How'd you do that?" Langston gave a small, tired smile. "Same way she saved me. You talk soft, not loud." The vet stared at him, realizing he was witnessing something fragile and rare, a trust built not by command, but by love that had been earned. He felt something stir inside, something he thought had died the day the river rose. Without another word, he reached again. This time slower, Iona didn't resist. He palpated her abdomen gently, his fingers tracing the curve of her belly. "There's another one in there," he said quietly. "Still alive, but she's too weak to push." Langston's eyes widened. "Can you get it out?" Emery hesitated. "Not without help. I'll need to operate. But she won't survive the anesthesia unless I stabilize her first." He looked around the room, scanning shelves that hadn't been touched in years. "There's adrenaline in the back cabinet, if it's still good." He moved quickly, finding the vial dust-covered but sealed. Langston stayed by Iona's side, whispering the same words over and over like a prayer. "You're strong, girl. You're the best of us." Emery drew the injection, his hands finally steady for the first time since the flood. He injected it near the shoulder and waited. Seconds stretched, then Iona's breathing deepened her chest, lifting with a stronger rhythm. Langston looked at him, eyes full of cautious hope. Emery nodded once. "It's working. She's fighting." Something shifted between the two men, then an unspoken recognition that neither was alone in this anymore. The past didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. "You said she found you after the flood?" Emery asked as he prepped the next instruments. Langston nodded. "She was half-starved, hiding under a bridge. People don't stop for dogs like her, but she stopped for me." The words hung in the air like scripture. Emery glanced down at the dog again, his reflection trembling in the stainless steel table. "Seems like she's been saving men her whole life." Langston met his eyes. The steel table reflected the glow of the surgical lamp, its hum the only sound in the room besides the shallow rhythm of Iona's breathing. Langston Price stood at her head, one hand pressed gently on her neck, his thumb stroking the line of her fur as if to remind her she wasn't alone. Dr. Emery Cade leaned over her abdomen, focused calm, now his hands moving with a precision he hadn't felt in years. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and rain-soaked earth, a mix of sterility and life clawing its way back into motion. The adrenaline had steadied Iona's pulse, but her exhaustion was clear. Langston's voice was a low murmur, almost a prayer. "You hold on, girl. You hold on, for me." Emery didn't speak. He couldn't afford to. His eyes followed the small incision, his tools glinting faintly under the weak fluorescent light. Each movement was deliberate, steady as if the past might forgive him if he did this one thing right. He'd failed before. Failed his daughter when the floodwaters rose, failed the animals that drowned in their cages, because he froze when the roof collapsed. But tonight he wasn't freezing. He was fighting. And as he worked, he realized he wasn't doing it for redemption or penance. He was doing it because this man beside him believed without question that the dog deserved to live, and that belief was contagious. Iona's body twitched. Langston's breath caught. Emery frowned, working faster. "We're close," he said, voice tight. "I need suction. Hold her steady." Langston pressed his weight against her side, sweat mixing with the rain still on his skin. The minutes stretched until they lost shape. Then, with one slow motion, Emery lifted his hands, and in them was a small, limp pup. It wasn't breathing. Langston froze, staring at the still form, its slick fur matted to the bone. The sound in the room changed the hum of the lamp, the faint ticking of a clock somewhere distant, and in that moment, time stood still. Emery placed the pup on a towel, his jaw tightening. He rubbed the small chest with 2 fingers, gentle but firm. "Come on," he muttered, voice barely audible. "Come on, nothing." Langston's throat constricted, his heart sinking. The memory of water and headlights and the roar of the river flooded back of when he'd thought he'd lost Iona once before. He whispered, "No, not like this. You can't go out like this." Emery kept rubbing faster now, his lips pressed together in grim determination. The pup remained still. Iona let out a weak whine as if calling for what she already knew was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. Emery stepped back, shoulders slumping. "It's gone," he said softly. Langston didn't move. He looked down at the lifeless form, his rough fingers trembling as he reached forward. "No," he said quietly. "She fought too hard for that." Before Emery could stop him, Langston cupped the pup in his hands and pressed its tiny body against his lips, blowing air in rhythmic bursts, gentle but desperate. "Come on, little one," he whispered between breaths. "Your mama didn't give up, and neither will I." Emery stood frozen, watching the man fight for something that science had already abandoned. For a moment, he wanted to say it was useless, that some things simply weren't meant to be saved. But then he remembered that cry, the one that had stopped him on the road, the one that had dragged him back here against every instinct. He stepped closer, his voice steady again. "Keep going," he said. "Don't stop." Langston didn't. The pup's chest remained still, its head limp, until suddenly a sound cut through the air. A faint squeak, small as a whisper. Then another. Langston's eyes widened, disbelieving. The pup twitched in his hands, coughing once, then breathing. A tear rolled down his cheek, cutting a clean line through the grime. Emery exhaled the weight of 10 years of failure, lifting off him like fog burning in sunlight. "You did it," he whispered. Langston shook his head. "We did." He laid the pup beside Iona's muzzle. The mother stirred weakly, licking the newborn with slow, deliberate care, her eyes half closed in exhaustion. Emery returned to his work, checking the incision, his movements lighter now, surer. "She's stabilizing," he said. "Her vitals are holding. The others might come naturally now." Langston brushed Iona's fur, his voice a mixture of relief and awe. "You hear that, girl? You're not done yet." The storm outside had softened to a light drizzle, the kind that carried peace instead of threat. Through the clinic window, dawn painted the sky in thin streaks of rose and gray. Emery caught himself looking at it, realizing how long it had been since he'd noticed the color of morning. He hadn't believed in signs in years, but this one felt undeniable, a second chance, not just for the dog, but for the man behind the scalpel and the man holding her paw. Iona gave a small whine as another contraction rippled through her body. "She's still pushing," Emery said. "Get the blanket ready." Langston nodded, ready this time, his fear replaced by fierce determination. The next pup came faster, slippery, and breathing faintly before its body even hit the towel. Then another. By the time the third arrived, Iona was trembling but alive, her eyes fluttering as if trying to stay awake for her own miracle. Emery worked silently, his face wet with sweat, though his eyes glowed with something gentler than triumph gratitude. He wrapped each pup, carefully placing them beside their mother, letting them root for warmth. The firstborn, the one Langston had revived, nestled against her side like it belonged there all along. The sight was enough to silence both men. The clinic, once haunted by loss, now pulsed with life again. "I don't believe it," Emery said quietly. Langston wiped his face, smiling through tears. Maybe believing's not the point. Emery looked at him, puzzled. Langston nodded toward Iona. The clinic lights still glowed behind them as they stepped into the rain-soaked morning, the storm giving way to soft mist that carried the smell of wet soil and second chances. Langston Price climbed into the back of the Jeep, holding Iona wrapped in the worn brown blanket, her body limp but still warm. The newborn pups nestled against her stomach, tiny and restless, mewling faintly, as if sensing the tension that hung thick in the air. Dr. Emery Cade checked the sutures one last time, wiped his trembling hands on his coat, and closed the rear door with a quiet finality that felt like a prayer. The road ahead shimmered with puddles and fog winding through the flat Mississippi plain, where ghosts still lived in the corners of their memories. "She'll need fluids and heat soon," Emery said, as he started the engine, his voice heavy but steady. "We'll set her up at the recovery shed by my place. It's not far." Langston nodded, eyes fixed on the slow rise and fall of Iona's chest. "She's a fighter," he murmured, "but she's tired, same as all of us." The Jeep lurched forward, tires cutting through the wet gravel, the rhythmic thud of the engine filling the silence that neither man dared to break. Emery's gaze flicked between the road and the mirror, watching the man in the back seat, the way Langston's rough hands moved with gentleness that defied every scar life had carved into him. It reminded Emery of himself before the flood, before fear turned his hands into stone. He cleared his throat. "You did good in there," he said softly. "Most people would have panicked." Langston looked up briefly. "You didn't." "I used to," Emery replied, his voice quiet, almost lost under the hum of the engine. "The last time I tried to save something I loved, I froze." The confession hung in the air, fragile and raw. Langston didn't press him, but something softened in his expression. "Then maybe this time's your second try," he said. Emery nodded, eyes fixed on the road ahead, the lines between guilt and redemption slowly blurring. But as the Jeep climbed the next hill, the sound of the engine was overtaken by something else, a sharp, sudden gasp followed by silence. Langston's head jerked down. "She's not breathing." His voice cracked through the quiet like a whip. Emery slammed the brakes, the Jeep skidding sideways on the slick mud before stopping hard. He was already out of his seat, running to the back, pulling the door open as Langston lifted Iona's head. Her body was slack, her chest still. "No, no, no, not now," Langston whispered, panic creeping into his voice. Emery reached for his kit, his hands moving fast but his thoughts spiraling. "She's gone into arrest," he said, barely holding his composure. "I need you to keep her head straight now." Langston obeyed, tears streaming down his face as Emery pressed his palms over Iona's ribs and began rhythmic compressions. 1, 2, 3, pause again. The rain began to fall harder, the sound mingling with their labored breaths and the faint cries of the pups inside the blanket. "Come on, girl," Langston pleaded. "You didn't drag me out of that river to die on the side of a damn road." Emery's jaw tightened. He pressed harder, faster, his heart racing in sync with the desperate rhythm. "She's not responding," he said, voice breaking. "Langston, I can't." "Don't you say," that Langston snapped the force in his words, slicing through the despair. "You told me to trust you. You don't stop now." Emery froze for half a heartbeat, then nodded, closing his eyes, letting instinct take over. He reached for the adrenaline syringe and drove it through the fur into the chest cavity. Seconds passed like lifetimes. Nothing. Langston's voice trembled as he whispered the words of an old lullaby one his late wife Mara used to hum when nights were too heavy. The same one he had sung in the flood when he thought he was going to die. "Hush now, don't you cry. The river runs wide, but the morning's dry." The melody cracked, broken by tears, yet it filled the cabin with something neither man had felt in years: grace. Emery's hands faltered for a moment as the tune reached him, recognition striking like lightning. His wife had sung that same lullaby to their daughter before the flood. He remembered her voice echoing through the house while the dog barked outside, remembered the sound of laughter before the world went silent. His throat tightened. He pressed again, tears mixing with rain. "Come back, girl," he whispered. "For him, for her, for both of us." Langston kept singing the tune, trembling through the air like a thread connecting the living and the lost. Then it happened, the faintest twitch under Emery's hands. A single shudder, then another. He froze, eyes wide. "Wait," he whispered. Langston leaned closer. Iona gasped, then coughed weakly, her body jerking as air filled her lungs again. The men stared in disbelief as her chest rose and fell, fragile but real. Langston broke down his forehead, pressed to her fur. "That's my girl," he said through sobs. "You keep fighting." Emery sat back against the Jeep, his hands shaking. He couldn't look at her without feeling the impossible weight of what just happened. The lullaby still echoed in his ears, its ghostly melody pulling something broken inside him back together. "You sang her back," he said, finally, his voice rough. "No," Langston replied. Wiping his face, she found her own way back. "We just kept the light on." Emery stared out the windshield, the rain washing over the glass and rivers. He hadn't believed in miracles since the day the flood took everything, but this felt like one carved out of pain and stubborn faith. He looked back at Iona, whose breathing had steadied, and at the pups curled against her. "We're not out of danger," he said after a moment, but his voice carried warmth now. "We keep her warm. We keep her moving. We don't stop." Langston nodded. "Not stopping's something I'm good at." Emery smiled faintly. "Yeah, I can see that." They drove the rest of the way in silence, the air inside the Jeep thick with exhaustion and awe. The road wound through flooded fields that glistened in the new light. The storm had passed, but the sky remained heavy with memory. As they pulled up to the recovery shed behind Emery's small farmhouse, Langston climbed out and lifted Iona gently, the pup still nestled close. The heater buzzed low in the recovery shed, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The smell of antiseptic lingered beneath the warmth of straw and wet fur, and outside the open door, the Mississippi night stretched wide and starless. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy and clean, and the only sounds were the occasional chirp of frogs and the rhythmic breathing of a dog that had come back from the dead. Langston Price sat in a folding chair near Iona's bed, his elbows on his knees, fingers knotted together like a man who didn't know if he was praying or simply holding himself together. Dr. Emery Cade leaned against the doorway, the red glow of his cigarette briefly cutting through the dark before he let it burn out between his fingers. Neither spoke for a long time, both caught between exhaustion and disbelief. Iona's chest rose and fell evenly. Now her pups nestled against her small bellies, rising like waves against the rhythm of her heartbeat. Every few minutes, Langston would reach down to adjust the blanket, his touch tender, protective, almost parental. Emery watched the motion, realizing how much it mirrored the way he used to check on his daughter when she was sick. The thought hit him hard, unexpected, and for a moment he had to step outside to breathe. He hadn't thought of her that vividly in years. Not the laughter, not the smell of her hair after rain, not the sound of her saying, "Daddy, you always fix things." The words came back like ghosts. Inside, Langston shifted, glancing toward the vet's silhouette in the doorway. "You should get some rest," he said quietly. "I'll keep watch." Emery shook his head. "I'm fine. You look worse than me." Langston gave a dry chuckle, though his eyes never left Iona. "Ain't about me. I promised her I'd stay." The conviction in his tone left no room for argument. Emery walked back inside and poured coffee into 2 metal cups, handing one to Langston. "Black. Only thing I got." Langston nodded, wrapping his hands around the cup, grateful for the heat. "Good enough." The silence returned, comfortable now. The 2 men drank in unison, each sip anchoring them to the present moment. Each glance toward Iona, a reminder that some miracles had to be guarded through the night. After a while, Langston's gaze fell to the collar tag lying beside the heater, the one he'd removed from Iona before the surgery. It caught the light just enough for him to notice faint etching beneath the grime. He picked it up, squinting, then rubbed the surface with his thumb until the letters appeared. "MKK-09, he murmured aloud. "What's that mean?" Emery looked up sharply. "Let me see." He took the tag, his brow furrowing. "That's an old shelter code from Tallahatchie Rescue Center. MCAK was for our intake records, K for Cade." He turned it over again, his voice dropping. "I marked it myself the day she came in. That was the flood year." The realization landed heavy between them. Langston looked from the tag to the sleeping dog. "So she's been with you before," he said. "Not just the same shelter you touched her once before she found me." Emery nodded slowly, his throat tightening. "She was in the last batch we pulled from the levee. My daughter. She helped that day. She was only 12, but she wouldn't stop handing me towels, telling me we had to save them all." His voice cracked, the memories breaking loose like debris in a rising tide. That night the storm hit harder, and by morning he stopped swallowing the words he'd never finished saying for 10 years. Langston set his cup down, understanding without needing more. "She didn't make it," he said softly. Emery nodded once, unable to look at him. "We lost the shelter too. That's when I stopped answering calls, stopped treating anything. I couldn't fix it, so I walked away." For a long time, the only sound was Iona's breathing and the faint crackle of the heater. Langston's eyes lingered on the sleeping dog, her muzzle twitching as if she dreamed of running. "Maybe she carried part of that day with her," he said after a moment. "Maybe she found me because she knew you couldn't." Emery looked up startled. "You think she remembered?" "I think some souls don't forget who saved them," Langston said simply. "They just wait until it's their turn to bring that saving back around." Emery leaned against the wall, his hands shaking slightly. "You talk like a preacher," No Langston replied, eyes fixed on Iona. "Preachers talk about heaven. I just talk about what's left of it down here." The words sank into the quiet, like seeds taking root. Emery found himself staring at the man who had nearly been a stranger just hours before, and realizing that in some strange way they were the same. Both men bound by grief, both anchored to the same animal who had carried pieces of their pain and turned them into something living. The clock on the shelf ticked past midnight. Langston's head drooped forward for a moment, exhaustion pulling him down, but he refused to close his eyes for long. Emery poured another cup of coffee, then hesitated. "You sure you want to keep sitting there? She's got me this far," Langston said with a faint smile. "I can do one night for her." Emery nodded, but instead of leaving, he pulled up another chair and sat beside him. "Then I guess we'll both keep watch." For a while, neither spoke. The heater hummed, the rain outside had stopped completely, and through the cracks in the shed's window, faint moonlight spilled across the sleeping dog and her pups. It was then that Langston began to hum again, the same lullaby he had sung on the road. The tune was slow, haunting the kind of melody that felt older than both men combined. Emery's eyes closed as the sound filled the space. He didn't stop it this time. He let it wash over him until the ache in his chest eased, until the guilt that had built like sediment began to loosen its hold. Without meaning to, he whispered the words to the second verse, his voice low and rough from years of disuse. "Hush now, don't you cry." Langston glanced at him surprised, but said nothing. The two voices blended, one broken by grief, the other bound by gratitude, weaving the same song into something whole again. Outside, an owl called once distant and lonely. Inside, Iona stirred in her sleep, one paw stretching slightly, as if responding to the sound that had once saved her too. Emery looked at her, his lips trembling. The first light of morning crept over the edge of the horizon like a promise whispered too softly for the world to hear. Inside the small recovery shed, the air had grown still heavy with the weight of sleepless hours. Langston Price sat where he had been all night, his back stiff, his hands clasped together loosely on his knees, the fatigue etched deep into his dark face. The heater still buzzed quietly in the corner, throwing an amber glow across the straw-lined bed where Iona lay. Her breathing, which had been steady through the night, had turned faint and shallow. Dr. Emery Cade sat across from him, a half-empty coffee cup cooling beside his boot. He stared at the floor, trying to convince himself that the rhythm of the dog's breaths hadn't changed. But the silence between each inhale stretched longer, the pauses sharp enough to slice through the hope they'd built during the night. Langston noticed first. He leaned forward quickly, placing a hand on her side. "Doc," he said, his voice tight. "Something's wrong." Emery was already moving, kneeling beside the bed, fingers pressing against her chest, feeling the sluggish beat of her heart. His mind raced through every possibility, blood loss, internal swelling, exhaustion, but none of it mattered if her heart gave out again. "Her pulse is fading," he muttered. "We can try another shot, but her system might not take it." Langston shook his head, fear gripping him harder than before. "No, you saved her once. She's not leaving now." He looked down at her face, at the soft curve of her muzzle, the small tremor in her paw. "You hear me, girl? You've still got work to do." His voice cracked the words, breaking under the weight of exhaustion. Emery reached for the medical kit, but his hands hesitated over the syringe. He could feel the ache in his chest, that familiar tightening of helplessness, the echo of the flood he had spent years trying to forget. "I don't know if she can take another hit," he said, barely above a whisper. Langston didn't move his eyes from her. "Then we hold her steady until she finds her breath." He placed one hand gently over her heart, the other over her head. The pup stirred beside her, squirming in the straw, their tiny cries filling the shed with a fragile, rhythmic life. Emery sat back on his heels, the sound piercing through his fear. It reminded him of something simple and pure, life fighting to exist. He watched as Langston kept talking softly to her, voice low and calm. "You've got little ones now. They need you more than I ever did." Iona's chest twitched beneath his hand, just once, faint but real. "That's it," Langston whispered. "Breathe, girl." Emery's eyes widened slightly. "Do that again," he said quickly. "Keep talking." Langston leaned closer, his voice trembling between command and plea. "You carried me through that river, Iona. You didn't let go then, so don't you let go now." The words seemed to reach her. Her paw flexed once, the smallest flicker of movement, then another. Emery reached for the stethoscope, holding it against her chest, his brow furrowing as the faint beat flickered, uneven but present. "She's fighting," he said, "but she's weak." Outside, the sky brightened by degrees, pale gray bleeding into soft gold. The light pushed through the window slats, landing first on the pile of straw where the pups lay. One by one, they began to wriggle closer to their mother-tiny bodies, pressing against her warmth. Langston froze, watching in disbelief as one pup nuzzled her fur, then found its way to her belly and latched on. Another followed, then another, their movements clumsy but determined. Emery looked up from the stethoscope, his eyes wide with disbelief. "They're nursing," he said quietly. "They weren't strong enough before." Langston blinked, his breath catching. "Then maybe they know something we don't." As the pups began to feed, Iona stirred, her muscles trembling under the weight of life returning. She exhaled sharply, almost a sigh, then inhaled again, a long, deep breath that filled the room with sound. The men froze, afraid to move, afraid the fragile miracle would vanish if they dared to believe in it too quickly. Then her tail twitched. Langston let out a sound somewhere between laughter and sobbing. "There she is," he said, voice breaking. "There's my girl." Emery didn't trust himself to speak. He just placed a hand against her ribs and felt the rhythm grow stronger, steadier, syncing with the heartbeat of her newborns. The morning light stretched further into the shed, illuminating the space where despair had lived only hours before. Emery leaned back against the wall, staring at the golden haze spilling across the floorboards. It had been years since he'd watched the sunrise like this, years since he'd let himself feel anything other than loss. "You ever think," he said slowly, "that some things survive just to remind us how to try again?" Langston nodded, eyes still fixed on Iona. "Maybe that's what she was made for." "And maybe that's what we're made for too," Emery added. Langston looked at him, then studying the man who had once been a stranger. In the light of dawn, Emery's face looked softer, younger, somehow, the shadows that had clung to him since the flood, fading little by little. "You're different now," Langston said quietly. "You believe again." Emery smiled faintly, a tired, honest smile. "I don't know if it's belief," he said. "Maybe it's just remembering what it feels like to hope." They sat in silence, the heater clicking as it cooled, the only sound, now the steady breathing of Iona and her pups. Langston finally leaned back in his chair, his exhaustion giving way to quiet peace. "You did good, Doc," he said. "You brought her back twice." Emery shook his head. "No," he replied. "You did. You never let go." Langston chuckled weakly. "Guess we both held on." The conversation faded as the light grew brighter, painting the walls in a wash of gold and soft orange. Iona lifted her head slightly, her eyes open now, hazy but alive. She looked at Langston, then at the man beside him, and let out a quiet, breathy sound somewhere between a sigh and a thank you. Emery stood slowly brushing straw from his coat and looked down at her. "You did it, girl," he said softly. "You beat the odds." Langston smiled through tears. She never liked odds anyway. The pups fed greedily, their tiny bodies pressing against her side like living proof that love and loyalty had found a way to win. Outside, the first birds began to sing their calls, threading through the air like distant hymns. Days turned to weeks, and the storms of that first night became only a memory that smelled faintly of rain and straw. The recovery shed had transformed into a sanctuary of quiet routines, the kind that mended souls without words. The heater no longer hummed constantly. Instead, the warmth came from the sun filtering through the cracks in the wood each morning. Iona thought thinner was strong again. Her fur gleamed in the soft light, and her movements carried that steady grace of an animal who had faced death and decided to stay. Her pups grew fast, 5 small shadows tumbling across the floor, their bark sharp and clumsy, their energy endless. Langston Price came every morning before sunrise, parking his truck in the same muddy patch beside the shed. He never knocked. He just walked in, set down a thermos of coffee for Dr. Emery Cade, and sat cross-legged near Iona's bed. Sometimes he brought scraps from home. Boiled chicken, old biscuits, a worn blanket that still smelled faintly of engine oil, and home. He spoke little, and when he did, his words were simple, the kind that carried weight without needing polish. "You're looking better, girl," he'd say, softly scratching the spot behind Iona's ear. "You got 5 little miracles there. You did good." The dog would nudge his hand, eyes, warm tail thumping lazily against the straw. Emery watched from the corner most mornings, pretending to read a veterinary manual he hadn't touched in years. He'd glance up every few minutes, his eyes lingering on the man and the dog, that unspoken bond that seemed to rebuild something in both of them. There was no ceremony, no grand conversation, just coffee steam, soft breathing, and a kind of peace neither man had known in a long time. For Emery, those quiet mornings became his own form of prayer. He found himself opening the clinic again, not to clients yet, but to life itself. He fixed the lights repaired, a window, cleaned the exam tables. Each nail hammered into place felt like another piece of himself returning. Langston noticed, but never said anything. He understood the rhythm of a man trying to heal in silence. He was doing it too, in his own way. Each visit was a ritual, a promise kept. Iona's recovery had become more than survival. It had become purpose. On the third week, when the pup started wandering outside, Langston built a small pen beside the shed. He didn't ask permission, he just did it. Emery watched from the doorway, half amused. "You plan on moving in?" he asked dryly. Langston smirked without looking up. "Someone's got to keep the little ones from wandering off. Can't have your new clinic mascot getting lost." Emery chuckled a sound that surprised him. "Clinic mascot, huh?" "You think I'm reopening?" Langston straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Already have," he said. "You just don't know it yet." That night, Emery sat alone after Langston left, staring at the faint glow of the lamp reflecting on his daughter's old stethoscope. He ran a thumb over the engraving Cade Family Clinic and felt a quiet pull toward the life he'd buried. The next morning, Langston didn't come. At first, Emery thought maybe the man was just late. The sun climbed higher, the coffee went cold, and the shed grew too quiet. Iona paced near the door, restless, whining softly. Her pups followed her tails, wagging confused by the sudden absence of the man, who always came with warmth and calm. By midday, Emery grew uneasy. He walked to the porch, scanning the road that stretched out like a thin scar across the flat fields. Nothing. For reasons he couldn't explain, fear crept in the same helplessness that had once kept him frozen during the flood. He tried to shake it off, but the longer the silence stretched, the heavier it became. "Maybe he's just resting," he muttered, but even his voice sounded uncertain. Hours passed. Then just before sunset, the distant rumble of an engine broke the quiet. The old truck appeared on the road, dust trailing behind it like smoke. When it stopped near the shed, Langston stepped out, carrying something wrapped in a tarp. His clothes were dirty, his hands covered in dried paint and sawdust. Emery opened the door, half irritated, half relieved. "You trying to give me a heart attack?" Langston just grinned, pulling the tarp away to reveal a wooden sign. It was rough, but beautifully made, the letters carved deep and clean. "Brookhaven Animal Refuge, rebuilt 2025. Emery stared, speechless. Langston set the sign down against the fence, brushing the sawdust from his jacket. "Figured she needed a home with a name," he said, nodding toward Iona, who had started wagging her tail wildly at the sight of him. "And maybe you needed a reason to open those doors again." Emery crouched beside the sign, his fingers tracing the carved letters. The word refuge hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't just about animals. It was about men like them, broken, wandering, searching for somewhere to belong again. "You built this yourself?" he asked quietly. "Had some help from the boys down at the mill," Langston said. "They owed me a favor. Figured I'd cash it in for something worth keeping." Emery looked at him, his throat tightening. "You didn't have to." "I did," Langston said simply. "You saved her, you saved me. Now we save something else." The air hung thick with meaning. For the first time since the flood, Emery didn't feel like a man looking backward. He felt like a man standing in the present, solid and real. "You think people will come?" he asked after a long pause. Langston shrugged. "They will. Folks always bring broken things where they think someone still cares." Emery smiled faintly. "And what about you?" "Guess I'll stick around a bit," Langston said, glancing at Iona. "She still owes me a few years." The two men laughed, the sound blending with the rustle of the tall grass and the faint cries of the pups. It was a sound of rebuilding, of something being stitched quietly back together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emery helped Langston mount the sign on the fence. The last nails went in easy, the hammer strikes echoing across the open field. When they stepped back, the sign caught the fading light glowing with a soft golden hue. Iona barked once, as if approving her pups circling her feet. Emery felt tears sting his eyes, though he blinked them away. "It's beautiful," he said. Langston gave a small nod. "So starting over." They stood there in silence for a moment. Two men who had walked through separate storms, only to find themselves standing in the same clearing. The sky above them turned deep violet, the first stars flickering into view. The night no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. As they headed back to the shed, Iona followed close behind her steps, steady her pups tumbling around her legs. The sound of their paws on the earth was steady and real, a rhythm of life that belonged entirely to this small, quiet corner of the world. Emery closed the shed door softly, looking once more at the sign glowing faintly in the dark. "Refuge," he whispered, tasting the word like something holy. Langston smiled, setting down the coffee thermos on the table. "Guess it's what we've all been looking for." The sky that morning carried the soft blue of early spring, streaked with the thin white trails of clouds stretching across the horizon. The air was cool, clean, and heavy, with the scent of new grass. For the first time in months, the fields around Brookhaven Animal Refuge looked alive again, bathed in a calm that seemed to belong to no one and everyone at once. Langston Price stood by the fence, his weathered hands gripping the worn wood as he watched Iona and her 5 pups play in the sunlight. Their fur shimmered gold and sable beneath the morning light, their tails cutting through the air like small banners of joy. Each bark was a small victory, a sound of living made louder by everything they'd survived. Dr. Emery Cade leaned beside him, a mug of coffee in hand, his old jacket half-zipped against the wind. "She's ready," he said, his tone a mix of pride and melancholy. "You did it, Langston. You got her through." Langston didn't take his eyes off the field. "We both did," he said quietly, "but that doesn't make it easier." Emery nodded understanding. "It never is. They'd known this day would come." The papers were ready, the release plan written down with precise instructions. Iona and her pups would be reintroduced to the open land near the Tallahatchie River Basin, the same place where Emery had once rescued her years ago. It was a place full of prey shelter and freedom, everything a dog like her needed to live as she was meant to. But neither man had been ready for what freedom meant, in this case separation. Langston turned his head slightly, his expression caught somewhere between pride and sorrow. "She's got everything she needs now, food, strength, her pups. Ain't much more I can give." "That's not true," Emery said softly. "You gave her what the world forgot, faith." Langston smiled faintly, and she gave it back. For a long while they stood in silence, listening to the wind sweep through the grass. The sound of life here was different now, calmer, fuller, almost sacred. Emery sipped his coffee, watching Langston's face the same way he used to watch a heart monitor searching for steady rhythm. "You gonna be okay?" he asked. Langston chuckled without humor. "I've been okay before. I'll manage again." He turned to the dog pen, calling softly. "Come here, girl." Iona lifted her head, immediately ears perked. She trotted toward him with a slow, confident stride, her body fully healed, her eyes sharp and knowing. The pups followed in a chaotic line, tripping over each other's paws. Langston knelt, rubbing her head gently. "You ready to go home, girl?" She tilted her head, then pressed her muzzle against his chest, that old gesture of connection that never failed to undo him. "Yeah," he whispered. "Me too." They loaded the family into the back of Emery's truck, the same vehicle that had once carried them from death's edge to salvation. As they drove toward the release site, the world outside the windows looked brighter, the sun cutting through the branches like threads of gold. The dirt road led them to the edge of the same pasture where it had all begun, the foggy field that had once echoed with Iona's cries of pain. Now it lay washed in light wildflowers pushing through the earth like defiance. Langston climbed out slowly, his boots crunching the gravel. Emery followed, grabbing the latch on the tailgate. "You sure about this?" he asked. Langston nodded, though his throat tightened as he spoke. "Yeah, she deserves it." They opened the gate, and Iona stepped down gracefully, sniffing the air, her ears twitching at the sound of wind moving through the grass. The pups jumped after her, stumbling but determined. For a moment they just stood there, frozen in place, the great open world stretching before them. Emery folded his arms. "They know," he said. "They feel it." Langston smiled sadly. "They know better than we do." Then, with one last glance over her shoulder, Iona took a few steps forward. The pups followed close behind, their small bodies weaving between blades of tall grass. Langston's chest ached. "There she goes," he whispered. Emery rested a hand on his shoulder. "That's how it's supposed to be." Langston nodded, but couldn't take his eyes off her. She reached the middle of the field, her form bathed in sunlight, then stopped. Her head turned sharply, ears perked. For one breathless moment, the air went still. Then the second twist came, the one neither man expected. Instead of continuing toward the wild, Iona turned back. She started walking toward them again, not running but moving with purpose, her gaze locked on Langston. The pups followed her, their small legs kicking up tiny bursts of dust as they trotted behind their mother. Emery whispered, astonished. "What's she doing?" Langston's voice broke as he answered. "She's coming home." Iona reached him, stopping just inches away, her eyes gleaming with quiet certainty. She sat down at his feet, then looked up at him, her tail thumping against the earth. One by one, her pups circled around her, pressing close against Langston's boots. The world held its breath. The wind moved again, soft and forgiving. Emery's face softened as he understood. "She's choosing," he said. Langston swallowed hard. "Guess freedom's not always out there." He knelt, wrapping his arms around her neck, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. "You've done enough saving for one lifetime," he whispered. "Maybe it's my turn now." Iona leaned into him, the weight of her head grounding him in a way that no sermon or prayer ever could. Emery turned away, blinking against the sudden sting in his eyes. "Looks like she made her choice," he said quietly. "Yeah," Langston murmured. "And I ain't gonna argue." They loaded her and the pups back into the truck this time, not toward release, but toward home, toward the refuge that had become more than just a shelter. The Mississippi summer arrived slow and cruel, the kind that baked the earth until it cracked and made the air shimmer with heat. Grass turned brittle, the rivers shrank to narrow veins of brown water, and the wind smelled of dry leaves and dust. Weeks had passed since Iona chose to stay at the refuge, her pups now grown enough to stumble clumsily through the fields. Life had found its rhythm again, morning feedings, evening walks, soft laughter shared over coffee, and quiet repairs. Langston Price had built a small shed beside the main barn and started calling it home. Dr. Emery Cade spent his days treating stray dogs that locals brought in him each visit. Another chance to prove that the refuge wasn't just rebuilt in wood and nails, it was rebuilt in faith. Every day felt like borrowed light, something fragile and rare. Then one afternoon in late July, the air shifted. The wind turned sharp, carrying with it the distant smell of smoke. Emery was the first to notice. He looked up from the exam table, nostrils flaring. "Do you smell that?" Langston stepped outside, scanning the horizon. A faint plume of gray curled above the trees to the west. "Fire," he said simply. They both ran. The field behind the refuge sloped downward into dry brush where the heat had been gathering for days. By the time they reached the ridge, the smoke was thicker, curling like a living thing. The flames had started small, probably from a lightning strike or a careless campfire, but the wind was feeding it, spreading it toward the line of oaks that marked the edge of the property. The pups barked frantically near the fence, sensing danger. Iona stood between them and the smoke, her ears back, her body tense. "We have to move them," Emery said. Langston didn't hesitate. "I'll take the dogs to the north pen," he said, grabbing the nearest leash. "You get the generator running for the sprinkler system." Emery sprinted toward the barn, while Langston rounded up the animals, shouting commands that cut through the roar of the wind. The air filled with ash, the sky darkened, and heat pressed down like a living weight. He moved quickly, loading the pups into the truck bed, coaxing the horses toward the back paddock. Iona stayed by his side the entire time, refusing to run, her movements sharp and purposeful. The fire reached the ridge just as Emery started the generator, a shuddering roar that sent streams of water spraying across the fence line. "We might hold it here," he shouted, his voice hoarse. Langston nodded, coughing through the smoke. "We just need time," but time was cruel in fire. The wind shifted again, pushing flames towards the barn, toward the old refuge sign they had mounted only weeks before. Langston saw it catch first, the faint curl of smoke rising from the edges of the wood. Without thinking, he ran. Langston Emery called, but the man didn't stop. He tore the sign down with his bare hands, the heat biting through the sleeves of his jacket. Behind him, Iona barked sharply, circling the pups as if commanding them to stay. Emery grabbed a bucket, dousing the ground, his lungs burning. "Leave it!" he shouted. Langston stumbled back, coughing, the sign clutched against his chest. "Not this," he wheezed. "We just built it." The fire line broke less than 50 yards away, flames twisting like serpents across the field. Then just as suddenly as it had begun, the rain came. A thunderclap split the sky open and water poured down in sheets so heavy, it drowned the flames before they reached the barn. Steam rose from the wet earth, the hiss of dying fire filling the air. Both men dropped where they stood, soaked, gasping, too stunned to speak. Iona came running through the mud, her fur plastered against her body, the pups trailing behind her like small shadows. She pressed her head against Langston's leg, whining softly, as if checking that he was real. He let out a shaky laugh and sank to his knees, burying his hands in her wet fur. "You did good, girl," he said, voice trembling. "You kept them safe." Emery collapsed beside them, rain dripping from his hair. "Guess the good Lord wasn't ready to let us go just yet." Langston looked at him, breathing hard. "Maybe he just wanted to see if we'd still fight." They sat there in the rain until the fire died completely. The refuge was spared, blackened in patches, but still standing. The sign lay on the ground between them, scorched at the edges, but intact, the words still visible. Brookhaven Animal Refuge. Rebuilt, 2025. Emery stared at it for a long time before picking it up and setting it against the fence again. "We'll sand it down," he said. "Maybe the burn marks will remind us what it cost." Langston nodded, too tired to speak. As the rain slowed, the light changed. The clouds thinned, and the sky opened to reveal streaks of amber and violet stretching across the horizon. Iona shook herself, sending water spraying across both men. Her pups yipped and chased one another through the mud, undeterred by the storm that had nearly taken them. Emery stood slowly, his back aching, his heart strangely light. "You ever think about how she always finds her way back?" he asked. Langston smiled faintly. "She remembers," he said. "Every time the world tries to take something from her, she remembers what she's got left." "And us?" Emery asked. Langston looked up at the glowing sky, the smoke still curling faintly above the trees. "Same thing," he said quietly. "We remember. That's how we keep going." They walked back toward the barn in silence, their boots sinking into the wet earth. The smell of smoke mixed with the sweet scent of rain-soaked grass, a reminder that destruction and renewal often came from the same storm. Inside, they dried the animals, replaced the soaked straw, and set up a fresh bed for Iona and her pups. The dog curled up immediately, her body forming a circle around her children, her breathing slow and content. Emery sat beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think miracles were loud, flashing lights, thunder some sign you could point at. But this, he gestured toward her, toward the man across from him. This is quieter, stronger. Langston nodded. Sometimes the good things don't come to save you. They just come to stay. Emery smiled, the first true smile he'd worn in years. Then I guess she saved us twice. Langston leaned back in his chair, exhaustion settling deep into his bones, but peace following close behind. Maybe that's what love does, he said. It saves you, then teaches you how to save somebody else. Outside, the rain tapered to a mist, the world clean again. The fields glistened under the rising moon, each drop of water catching the last light like glass. Inside the shed, Iona's pup slept against her, their tiny breaths syncing with hers, while the two men sat quietly in the glow of the lantern. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full. Emery looked towards the door where the burned sign leaned and whispered, "The heart remembers, doesn't it?" Langston met his gaze. "Every piece of it," he said, "even the broken parts." The wind stirred softly through the open window, carrying the scent of wet grass and new beginnings, and the night held them all, the men, the animals, the refuge bound by the kind of peace that only comes when something once lost finally finds its way home. The end. If this story touched your heart, hit like and subscribe so more people can hear it. Tell us what part moved you the most and where in the world you're watching from in the comments below. Your thoughts keep stories like this alive.